So I will just start off with the first
Cool.
question that I'm curious about, which is your earliest memory of using your imagination to create something that you were excited about.
Oh, my earliest imagination memory that to create something that I was excited about. I think two things immediately pop into my head, and I'm not really sure where on the sort of time spectrum which one came first. So I'll just tell you about both of them. My first memory of using my imagination is with Legos. My parents are pretty were pretty strict and conservative, and we also like grew up in the hood, so they wouldn't let us like play outside too much.
Mhm.
So they bought us like we'd have like Tupperwares and Tupperwares filled with Legos.
Mm.
And so I remember having my brother and I would like push our beds to the side. So like that's how much space we were using with the Legos. And I distinctly remember, you'd go off the pack, right? Like let's say if you got Stormtrooper set, you kind of, you're working in that arena. If you got the sort of architectural model set, you're working in that arena. And I remember the feeling of like, ooh, I got all these different sets. Like, how about we make an architectural, like, how about we make like a flying city instead of the Stormtrooper shit? Like, that's kind of whack, And I remember sort of just late nights building stuff like that. But that's one memory. And I think the other is I used to have these little notebooks where I would call it drawing. I wouldn't call it like, even if it wasn't particularly creative, it was sort of like working those muscles. But I used to copy Pokemon cards and copy Yu-Gi-Oh cards because I really like the art. It's like they're really, I think cards in general, playing cards, trading cards, are a pretty fantastic avenue for like package design. Because really it's a package, right? But it's smushed together. And so it's like almost like a package of all these tiny little designed packages. So I remember copying those down and just being like, oh, I'm copying that. And then when I went to school, so from sixth grade to seventh grade, I went from a public school to a private school in New York, and the resources changed dramatically, at least the resources that are available to you as a student. And so we had, dedicated art teachers. And I remember Miss Bocella, shouts out to Miss Bocella, I had a huge crush on her. But I remember I was sitting down one day and she was like, hey, like, you're making art. And I was like, nah, man, I'm making Yu-Gi-Oh cards. And she was like, no, you're making art. Like, even though you're copying it, your lines have a different quality to them. Like, your shapes are a little wonky. Like, this is your sort of lens on this thing that you're seeing. And then she started to like show me different artists. Like, I didn't even understand that as a conception of a career path or anything like that. So that was sort of the first like, oh, you can do these things, and this isn't just, I think a lot of the time when you're younger, this goes for art and for a lot of other things, but shit's just there, so it's kind of like, you almost kind of think of it as a tube, like one thing goes in, something else comes out. And then you're like, all right, it's 6 o'clock, it's dinner time. I don't know where food comes from. It's just time to eat.
Inputs and outputs.
Right, inputs and outputs. So I think those are two sort of things that jump out to me immediately when I think of just sort of early sort of recognition of any sort of creative sort of impulse,
Yeah. So was home New York early on?
Yeah. So I grew up in Brooklyn.
Gotcha. And you said your family was conservative?
So my parents from Trinidad. So they both migrated here in the 80s. Okay. And so I think from that, they were just really, not really conservative. It's, I find that immigrants tend to be like conservative on some things, and then on other things that you'd expect them to be conservative on, like really liberal, actually. So they were religiously conservative for sure. But kind of speaking to that point, like, so I went to art school. and I was very like, you have the trope of like the immigrant parent who's like, you gotta be an engineer, you gotta be
Mm.
a this. Like that
Yeah.
was very much not my parents.
Gotcha.
They were like, all right, cool. Like this shit's weird. We don't really get it or understand
Yeah.
this, but like word, like just let us know how much
Yeah.
that paintbrush set is,
Yeah.
and fuck that it's that expensive, but like we'll get
Yeah.
it.
Wow.
So
So
I
what
consider myself very lucky in
Yeah.
that aspect, yeah. Because my parents are not like they were not going to museums, they were not going to, they're not particularly well versed in like, the humanities. Like they would take us to museums because they were like, that's what you do as a good parent, you take your
Mm.
kid to the museum,
Mm. Is
uh,
there something about culture in Trinidad that lends itself more to occupations that are in the creative arts? Is like what are the big industries there that maybe people would be participating as like a professional career?
Well, I think for the most part, I mean, well, my parents, I guess like I only have like a certain sample set, right? Like
For sure.
my parents in Trinidad, my dad was
Okay.
a carpenter slash aspiring calypso musician. So
Nice.
he was trying to get it in on the weekends, and there's like
Mhm.
old pictures of him in his like full, in his full body like sequined like get-ups, which is interesting because that to me felt like a very immediate response from the 60s soul records and the
Mm.
four dude bands and stuff like
Mhm.
that, coordinated dancing and
Yeah,
that
yeah.
kind of stuff. And my mom grew up, her parents owned a farm, and so they just used to sell produce in the market. So to be honest, I think it I would push back on that a little. I would say that it's kind of the opposite. I found that most people were working class, either working at a farm, working at a bakery. There isn't necessarily a huge cultural, like there aren't sort of institutionalized, like sort of pockets of humanity that one can the humanities that one can access. Like there aren't huge amounts of libraries, there aren't huge amounts of museums, there aren't crazy amounts of concert halls, right? Like
Mhm.
that being said, I think the major sort of creative sort of job paths would be music, because I think a
Mhm.
lot of the time, like, the US, its major export is entertainment, right? And
Mhm.
culture. So, and especially after World War II, especially in the 50s to 60s, we're
Mhm.
pumping out music. People
Mhm.
in Japan, in Trinidad, in South America, they're sort of sucking that up and
Mhm.
sort of putting their own spin on it. So I think
Mhm.
that was definitely a huge creative outlet for people.
Mhm.
At least
Mhm.
at least in terms of like what I understand in my family and my sort of
Right.
relationship with the culture,
Mhm.
because I remember my dad was super like he loved music always, and
Mm.
I get like most of the music I listen to is in some way, shape, or form endemic to music that he was putting me on to, like
Mhm.
old soul and, a lot of calypso and like, I don't know if do you know Burna Boy?
I don't.
He's a Nigerian artist who I really like and who's kind of popping off right now. But when I think of Burna Boy, it's Nigerian music, but it reminds me of Trinidadian music,
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
it feels sort of like one and the same there.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
As you're observing your dad's passion for music, I think it's interesting when we look at people that we admire loving something so much, especially as a child, like curious about that intensity of that love for that
Right.
thing. And so for a while, at least in my experience, you kind of emulate it for a while, or you're just like really curious about it. Like, how do you love something like that much? But then only over time do you start to realize the meaning behind it, why they were drawn to it
Right.
in the first
That
place.
relationship with it.
Exactly. So as you're kind of growing up and maybe even up till now, like how do you better understand your dad's love for music now than when you first kind of realized that that was
Oh,
something
that's
he
a
was passionate
good
about?
that's I think, well, for a while I always just sort of thought of it as like, oh, my dad loves music. My parents listen to music all the time.
Mhm.
But I think as I got older and as I got to know more about my dad, then I understand that, oh, he loves music so much first because it was a passion and he wanted to pursue it. But then I think because, he moved here and ended up doing something completely different, he started working with construction. When he moved here, I understood that that's a very warm air for him, right? Like that's a very like hallowed ground. Like, oh shit, I wanted to do that. I wanted to be that. So I gotta hold it close. And it has it's a lot more of a relationship with him. And I feel similarly about art and graphic design and illustration and poster design and stuff like that, because I went to art school and worked as a freelance designer for a while, and that was cool, but like couldn't really hack it and couldn't really figure out the freelance thing. Some people are better at freelance than others. I definitely needed more structure for sure. And I was like, Nike, why are you not calling me? What the fuck?
I'm right here.
Yeah, waiting by the phone. What's going on? But then similarly, I have such a fondness for that specific avenue of arts, right? Like the print arts, graphic arts. Like I fucking love that shit. Like, and so I think I do an artist series with NotAPlantShop where I'll either give. It sort of morphed and shifted, but in the very beginning, it was just like, okay, I had gotten a bunch of these white pots, just plain boring ass fucking white pots, kind of like Swedish, like thin legs, just white, true to materials, that kind of thing. And so I was like, all right, how can we make this more fire? Obviously, we should give it to graphic artists and just let them do their thing with it, and then afterwards we'll auction it off. And I don't think that would have been even an instinct or an impulse if that wasn't me trying to like, all right, like how can we constantly like engage with this thing even though we're not sort of occupationally engaging with it, right? Like how do you? I think if you wanted to be an architect and then you ended up being a dog or you ended up owning a vet or a dog kennel, you'll probably be really excited about building the dog kennels or the parts and pieces that you can like, how can I pull this back into that universe a little bit, so I definitely see similarities there in my relationship with music and his relationship with the arts for sure.
So finding the thing that you always connect with in kind of everyday things, or the job that the only job you could get, or the only work that's available at the moment, like digging in and being like, all right, this is my specific love, like how do I find a piece of that in a place that may be unexpected?
And like I think that's a lot of times why, like when people are older, why you'll find they volunteer in very specific ways. There's like I go thrifting a lot for a lot of my the pots that I find.
Yeah.
And there's a thrift shop in Munda Lane. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, but there's a thrift shop in Munda Lane that's a half thrift shop, half pet rescue. And it's all these older ladies who just like on the weekends, they're just like running this pet shop, but it's like you can tell there's something in, there's some relationship with either animals or pet rescue or some veterinary, like they wouldn't be there if they didn't have some sort of relationship with that thing, right? So I think a lot of the time you are just a confluence of your interests and experiences, right, over time, and you can choose to revisit, you can choose to sort of re-inject them into your life, and so yeah.
All right, so let's go back to early days in New York. You're a kid playing with Legos. You are copying Pokemon cards. And then your teacher says that this is art. What do you feel like you were saying when you said, no, this is a Pokemon card? Like, what do you feel like you were differentiating there?
Oh, well, I think I just didn't know, really. I don't think I was conscious of like what I was differentiating between. I think I just had no idea. And I think also art is a very, at least institutionalized art is a very white space, right? And it's a
Mm,
very sort of like old money. It's kind of an old boys club, you
mhm,
know?
mhm.
Like, especially as fine artists, like you can be a fine artist, but if you're trying to ball out like David Choi, like, or like, Frank Stella, or you're like even someone as mainstream as Jackson Pollock, like you got to know how to play the gallery game.
Mhm.
Like, you got to know which shows to go to. You got to know how to like sort of market your art. You got to know like how much art is too much to put out at once. You got to get people who have a lot of money. Like if
Yeah.
you want to pump the value up of your art, or you value it at a certain sort of monetary amount, you can't sell it to people who don't have bread. you know,
True.
it's like, you can't be like, oh, hey, like you want to set up a payment plan for this thing I really think is
Yeah.
precious. you know,
Yeah.
so I think that was part of it too, feeling like, well, that feels like a thing that's like inaccessible to me. Like that
Mhm.
feels like, oh no, I can't not. That's like a whole nother thing. Like we're just
Mm,
doing the Yu-Gi-Oh cards, lady. Like what are you talking about?
yeah.
So I think that's more what it was. Just being unfamiliar with it and being like, no, 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 no. I know what I'm doing.
Mhm,
It's about the hit points.
mhm.
Like less
Yeah.
than that.
I think that's an interesting thing to be in touch with so young. Just that whatever you were creating was very close to you and was like
Yeah,
in your space. And then there's this other word used that had all these connotations that then seemingly, and correct me if I'm wrong, felt like it took it out of your space and put it into this realm where it was no longer yours to
definitely.
hold.
Yeah, because I mean, when I think about that experience, the experience of creating those cards, what comes to mind is I had a bunk bed. My brother used to live on top. Well, he used to sleep on top. There was a little bookshelf next to the bed, and so I had a little lamp next to it, and it was real yellow. I remember the light, the quality of the light was very warm,
Mhm.
but not in a good way, like piss warm.
Sure.
But that's what I think of. You know what I mean? I think of the light being off and like this lamp and like leaning over my bed onto the shelf and just like working out the drawings. You know what I mean? So it's like,
Mhm.
but then when you sort of contrast that with what the shit that she started showing me, it's like you walk into a gallery, the lights are very white.
Mhm.
Walls are all white. You can see everything. If there's a black speck, you can see it because it's
Mhm.
intent. Like the intent of the wall is to fall away so the art can push into the foreground, right? So I think I was probably really intimidated by that.
Mhm. Was there
Yeah.
was there an aspect of curiosity in that when that word was used? Like, it
Oh,
could be that?
definitely. I wouldn't say curiosity about fine art as a like as an occupation or a genre,
Mhm.
but I think I felt really curious about the shit that she was showing me and
Mm.
how she, because it was like, all right, I want to hear about like that art shit, but like those drawings you showed me are actually kind of fire. Can we
Mm.
look at more of those? Like she started showing me like Jasper Johns and like Frank Stella, and she started showing me like super hard edged painters who were just using color really hard, in really flat graphic ways that are, very much so above my sort of like head at the time. But I
Mm.
remember being like, yo, I just fuck with these colors. Like this is cool. And
Mhm.
I think Frank Stella in particular, the thing I thought really latched me onto him when she sort of explained it to me, she was like, okay, this is, for example, there's a piece called Takti Suleiman, and it's just, concentric circles and triangles and stuff like that. And you look on the page and that's how it looks. But then when she explained to me, she was like, okay, so you see how it looks. The canvas is actually shaped in the way
Mhm.
that the colors are going. So it's not just like a square and he filled in some and left the rest. She was like, when you see it in person, this thing is 25 feet long,
Mm.
and it's like this guy's taking the wood and bending it and cutting it and making these shapes so that the colors themselves, the color fields, are actually a form. They're not necessarily just painted. They're not 2D, they're 3D, you know? So it was more like, oh shit, okay, that's really cool. Look at the capabilities here. Like, what if you built your own canvases? And I think like, so then going into like high school, my mom sewed a lot. And like, so when we go to church, like she'd make clothes for everyone in the church. Like she was nice with the sewing. And I remember she used to have, sewing patterns, tracing patterns. And she would have like buckets and buckets, like big storage containers of tracing patterns. And so I remember feeling very similar to that, being like, oh, like what if I use the tracing patterns on canvas and then painted on top of them? I'm by no means like an artistic genius. They were pretty trash, but you get what I mean? Like trying to understand like, oh, okay, like it doesn't always have to be super flat and graphic and just sort of seeing what the capabilities are there.
I mean, I think that's where I come from is from a very structured, lots of rules. And so following the rules was so important. And so creativity wasn't so natural. I didn't feel that creative freedom to say like, oh, I can bend these rules, but it sounds like yours was quite different than that. So was that modeled for you just in the house, or where do you feel like that permission that you gave yourself
to bend? I don't know if that was necessarily modeled. I guess in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. Like, I think my dad is definitely the more creative of the two. My mom is like the structured, a little bit more pragmatic, if we want to say that. So my dad is the kind of person where my mom, let's just say cooking, because I love cooking. We all kind of love cooking in different capacities. My mom would be like, we watched Rachel Ray. And because she, when you're an immigrant, I think a lot of people either hold on to the culture really hard, or some people are like, all right, we got to figure out this American shit, Yeah. And so I think she did a bit of both, but there was definitely times where she was like, all right, we're going to watch the Food Network and see, we're going to like, what's a pesto? I remember she was like, she loved pesto but it was like a new discovery for her.
Sure.
But she'd be like, okay, Rachel Ray put us onto this pesto. This is how we're going to make it. And it has to be this oil. And we're also going to call it EVOO because that's what Rachel Ray says, But then my dad is very much so like, this is the recipe. How about we just throw this in it? And if it's disgusting, that's fine. We'll figure it out. Like we'll either order some food, or we'll just, if we got time, we'll make some more, or we'll just eat it because that's all we got right now. So in that sense, there was definitely some creativity models there.
Yeah.
But also, like, my parents didn't really have a great relationship. And so there was a lot of sort of, they were always like on the rocks. And so I spent a lot of time alone. And my parents also worked a ton. So a lot of, at least in my high school years, a lot of my time was spent like smoking weed, chilling, smoking weed, listening to music. And like a big thing was biking. Just like after school's over at 3:10, hop on the bike, smoke a split with my buddies, and then you go uptown to MoMA, or like go to the Guggenheim, or just like go to Central Park, or do whatever, and just be. And that's the thing I liked about being in the city. Like you have access to to pretty much anywhere, right? Like you can go see different like styles of art. You can go see graffiti. You can go see you can go to Sunset Park and get some Asian food. You can get especially in the neighborhood that I grew up in. I grew up in Crown Heights, which at least at the time was pretty much 50-50 Hasidic Jews and Caribbean folks. Okay. So, there was kind of these pockets and you can kind of bounce around. And also the school I went to, the high school I went to was a laptop school, which was kind of crazy at the time. Like everyone had a laptop from 5th grade. Everyone had a laptop, which is, some bougie private school shit. But at the same time, I no longer had to share the desktop. So there was.
So you could take that home.
No, it was yours. It was 100% yours. And so I could, like when LimeWire came out, I was like,
Oh, that's so
crazy, you know? And like I remember that's where another side of that fascination with music came in. But like, you know, people's relationship with music is so different sometimes. And like for me, a lot of it is like fact and like ecosystem based. So
mm,
like one of the big things I would do when I was younger, when I was listening to music, was like I love the facts, you know, the like Snapple facts on all the shit. So it's like you download, like, you know, you could download huge discographies or whatever.
mhm.
Like you download, let's say you downloaded Bob Marley's discography, and then you listen to, and I would always listen to them in order of like when the albums came out. But
Mm,
then you'd realize like, oh, Three Little Birds is kind of whack and pop. Like not whack, is a phenomenal song, but like you'd be like, oh my god, like look at the relationship and how this has changed. And then from there, then you sort of move on to other artists because you find out there was a producer on a bunch of these tracks, and then
yeah,
what else did that person produce? Or, you know, for example, like when I first got into Tribe, like I was listening to Tribe, and then, you know, they're mentioning like native tongues, and you're like, okay, what's that? And then
right.
you go from that to Jungle Brothers, and then from that you go to De La Soul, and then but you sort of start building out this ecosystem. It's kind of like a game map. So I think having a lot of alone time was huge for me because it allowed me to like watch a ton of movies that I had not been exposed to, especially in like I have my own laptop, so like I can be alone in my room. I don't need you to buy me this movie ticket. I'm about to pop some popcorn, baby. Like I'm about to get it. So that was sort of like that. I guess there was no permission
Yeah,
in that regard, you
yeah,
know.
fascinating. I think it's interesting you bring up LimeWire because I do think that that is the infinite becoming accessible. I think
Oh, for
it's both
sure.
thrilling, and I'll just speak from my experience, both thrilling and then it's interesting because once you have everything, then things can become diluted. It's like, well, I have access
It's
immediately.
all here, yeah.
Yeah, how did you maintain specialness in what you were consuming at that time without it just being like, yeah, I guess a wash is kind of my own.
Yeah.
If I'm projecting, then if you just loved it, then that's your experience. But like,
Yeah,
did
yeah,
you ever
yeah.
bump into like, well, there's no limits, so like, what makes this special?
You know, to be honest, I don't even know if I had that experience
Okay,
because I can only remember feeling so fucking excited. Like, I don't know if you would stack your LimeWire like this, but I'd stack it with like 20 downloads at a time, baby. Like, let's fucking load this up, you know? So I'd be
mhm,
like waiting for like the next one to come. I think also like I was saying, my parents were really strict and we were really religious too. I'm no longer religious, but when I was younger, we were really, really religious, and I wasn't really allowed to consume a lot of media that was like sort of
mm,
outside of the bounds of like
mm,
what my parents were spiritual Baptists, which is like a Trinidadian Yoruba based branch of Christianity. Yeah, it was just exciting because I was like, yo,
sure.
Wu Tang's crazy. These motherfuckers are crazy. Like ODB is smoking crack, like, and talking about it, you know, and like, so I think it was just so interesting, and I think, yeah, I think just having the knowledge at my fingertips was pretty like that was pretty engaging for sure.
Mhm. So the lack of restriction was actually exciting
Yeah,
territory.
yeah, dude, definitely,
Mm,
definitely, definitely. And it also allowed me to engage with music that I would not have gotten from my parents. Like I
mm,
remember listening to the Beatles and my dad being like, "This is some weird white people shit, man. I don't fuck with this." And I
mhm,
was like, "Yo, man, you know, when you listen to it, you're like, yo, these chords are beautiful." Like,
mhm,
you know, and I think he just had never really heard it before.
mhm.
So after a while, he was like, "All right, I see what you mean. I guess it's just kind of hot,"
Yeah, yeah.
you know. But like, that was also part exciting about it too. Like, oh, my parents don't know about all this shit. Like,
Oh, sure. So you're going to a high school that's focusing on art, giving you lots of access to things that
mhm.
maybe were inaccessible or more restricted up to that point. what did you find yourself then like narrowing in to creatively express at that time? What were your mediums that became most enjoyable and
Right.
or the most fulfilling to you? Or did you try some things that just didn't work, and what were those things as well?
I don't think I really tried a ton that didn't work. Like I was doing like at least in high school, like when I think about like I to give you context, I went into college as a painting major and a
Okay.
French studies minor.
Okay.
So I've been doing languages, like I loved languages because the middle school I went to was super small and Christian, and so they made you take Latin and another language. So from there, there's sort of like this structure that's really cool in Latin, and it's like once you get that structure down, it's actually pretty simple to sort of understand how at least most Romance languages function. And that, through that school, at the end of the year, at the end of eighth grade, we had this module that ran from seventh grade to eighth grade. You took a year worth of humanities courses and art history in seventh grade, and this is everyone in the school. And then in eighth grade, you do the same thing, and at the end, the whole school goes to Italy and you visit all the places that you learned
Oh,
about.
wow.
You go to Assisi and Rome and blah, blah, blah. But I was doubling up on arts and languages. So in high school, I was taking Spanish and French and like double art history, AP studio art, like that was sort of what my schedule looked like. Like as soon as they were like, oh, you don't have to take science anymore, I was like, sick. Cool.
No problem. I know what to do.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. So yeah, a lot more focus on that kind of stuff. Art school for me was really hard because it's like at Syracuse, I went to Syracuse, they teach you in sort of like the Bauhaus style, which was a very sort of like arts and crafts movement, like way of learning art. Like, okay, if you're going to be an artist, if you're going to be a fine artist, you should know how to at least do the basics of furniture making. You should know how to draw. You should know how to paint. You should know how to do 2D. You should know how to do some sculpture. You should know how to do some metalworking. Shit don't work like that no more, So you'd get there and they'd be like, this is how you have to do this. Whereas before in high school, it was like, all right, I've smoked all these packs of cigarettes. I want to use them for my next piece. And nobody's allowed to tell me anything because my art teacher is just like, okay, keep going, keep going, keep going,
Yeah.
Yeah, so I definitely fell pretty hard into just like visual art and language. And I think also sort of back to what we were talking about before, it was so different from what my parents were doing, and it was such a world away from them that it was really exciting, So I was just painting all the time, really.
I think it's interesting that you did languages and kind of connecting it back to music, of just finding the common thread and then seeing that, oh, these things interconnect and they like have
Right.
a common core, that if you explore that core, then you can have easier access maybe
To many other things. Right.
exactly. So you can, I mean, literally, but also figuratively speak more languages rather
Right.
quickly if you explore kind of these roots that like have influenced all of these other things.
Right. Well, I think
Did you
also
feel
the
like-
thing I liked about language is like language can be pretty fun because I think languages are very telling about, it's kind of like slang. They're very telling of the people and culture that choose to employ them, right? So it's like in French, the noun rides the adjective. It does not work that way in English. So I don't, and maybe this is a reach, but they've chosen to structure their language in that way, right? With some confluence of events that made them choose to structure their language that way. So like, for example, one of my good friends was French, and she told me the story how when she was younger, she learned French first and then learned English. She would always say, the car red. I saw a car red. In English, we say a red car. So it's more what comes first, what's more important, at least in terms of the order, is how we describe the thing. And then the thing comes afterwards, as opposed to in French, it's the opposite, right? So it's like, there was sort of that like, oh, okay, y'all choose to say this way, but why do you say it that way? Why? why aren't there direct translations for some things, even though we have the same feelings, we have the same
Right.
experiences sometimes, you know? So I thought that was kind of cool.
Mhm. For sure. With painting, did you see that as kind of an access point to a lot of other things?
No, not really, to be honest, because I feel like like many a art student before me, a huge influence on me was Basquiat. And I
Mhm.
remember like being like, yo, this shit's so fresh, but my man definitely was homeless and definitely was doing heroin.
Yeah.
So but it was just exciting, really.
Mhm.
I wasn't really seeing it as all right, I'm about to like pop this art shit off and then be the next Jeff Koons. Like
Mm.
it was sort of just like let's just follow, some people the expression like follow the money. Like it was
Mhm.
more like follow the pleasure, you know.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point. Were you ever discouraged from following pleasure?
Nah, I mean, at least in terms of how I sort of diametrically opposed them just now, following money and pleasure. I mean, we didn't have any money, so I was like, all right, well, I don't got no bread anyway.
Mhm.
So
So
I'm
it is
not
pleasure.
scared of being broke, you know? There's sort of no fear of losing something that you don't have,
Yeah, yeah.
right? So I remember feeling like, yeah, no, this feels good. And, if we could make some bucks off this, cool.
Mhm.
But if not, also cool, you
For
know?
sure. So art school was a mixed bag of
Yeah, art school was a mixed bag. I hated art school. I fucking hated art school. I had a lot of good experiences, to be honest, and I think a lot of the way I think about like sort of art as a product now is definitely from school. Like
Hmm.
I tend to have a bit of a sort of conflicting relationship with a lot of artists sometimes because I very much so see art as a product, whereas a lot of people see it like extension of self and you know blah blah. It's like, yo, at the end of the day, someone is paying you money for this shit. Like this is a
Mhm.
product. But that's also a function of me studying design and illustration, right?
Mhm.
Like when you're doing an illustration for a magazine, you can't be like, hey man, this isn't like quite perfect yet. Like they're like, yo, we gotta go to print, bro. Like you better like we need that by 12,
Mhm.
And I think a lot of artists find themselves at a block because they put their own need. I mean, it depends on what kind of artist you are. I'm speaking very broadly here, but like
Mhm.
I do think it's important and pretty imperative actually as an artist to consider the needs of the viewer
Mhm.
in addition to the needs of yourself,
Mhm.
right? Because if you're just making what you want to make and not responding to the viewer at all, I'm not saying that that has to be the total, you
Mhm.
know, you always have to be, oh, well, what do people want? What do people want? But like,
Mhm.
if you're like making something, if you're making cabinets and you want to make cabinets that are 10 feet tall, they're not gonna go in anyone's house because they can't reach them. Like you gotta kind of consider how this is gonna operate in someone's world if you want it to live in that way, right? But if you want to do fine art that functions as this is art as a cultural sort of that only exists in the gallery and it's just sort of like cultural conversation, doesn't really live in
Mhm.
people's homes. Yeah, have a fucking blast.
Yeah.
Do you. But
Right.
if you're designing packaging for Coke or if you're designing a mural for a community organization, you very much so have to keep in mind the needs and wants of the people that are hiring you,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So art school, I think, was very difficult because it kind of forced me to realize that, because I'm just
Mhm.
like chilling, smoking weed, like making my art. I'm just like making my cool shit, and they were like, all right, cool, but like you also need all this shit over here.
Yeah.
You it's very much so a business.
So you see that relationship with art school as there was a conflict there, but you
Definitely.
think that you came out with it with an understanding that you still hold today of, like, how you yourself want to
Oh, for sure.
create
Yeah.
and or
Yeah, because I mean, I did also find that there was creativity in like there could be creative liberty in something like consumer packaged goods or
Mhm.
like poster design. Because I remember the first day of like our major design course where everyone in the major was in it. And this is kind of what got me hooked, to be honest. As much as I hated it, I like loved that piece of it. Our first project, it was called the baking soda project. And essentially, we all have one, we have to design one product that uses baking soda. So the idea is go home, look at all the uses you can find of baking soda.
Mhm.
You know, the next day people are like, all right, you can put it on jellyfish stings for, instead of peeing on it at the beach.
Mhm.
You can use it to calm a stomach. There are all these, like if you go online, you'll find all different kinds of uses for baking soda.
Mhm.
And the idea was like, okay, pick one of those uses, find a problem, pick one of those uses, design a product, and then you design the packaging for it. It was more in like design thinking and like problem based design
Mhm.
than, all right, how do we make this pretty? How do we make stickers? How do we make posters? How do we do this? But I
Mhm.
remember that I was like, ooh, I love this. Like I I'm pretty like product obsessed. Like I love products. Like
Mhm.
what does a product look like and how do you change the form of it? How do you change the shape of it?
Mhm.
So that definitely stayed with me, and I think that's something that's like a through line for me now. Like I always get excited about like alt economy shit. Like I do know Joey from Flavor Supreme,
Not personally, but
but you're
I follow him
familiar.
on, yeah, yeah, on
I
Instagram.
think I think their shit is crazy.
Mhm.
Like people, I'm sure it's kind of like in the way that I don't know if you listen to How I Built This with Guy Raz, but he interviews different people, and a lot of the time he interviews like successful entrepreneurs, and a lot of the time they're like, yeah, like people told me it'd be weird to sleep on somebody's couch and pay them for it,
Mhm.
Airbnb. Like
Mhm.
people said it'd be weird to get in a stranger's car, Uber.
Mhm.
It's like we have these conceptions of what a product looks like.
Mhm.
But when you start asking yourself questions, a lot of that falls away. So like stuff like Joey's project and like Alicia from Immortal Milk, like absolutely fascinating to me
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
like her cheese boards, insane. And especially during quarantine, I remember me and a friend had gotten a board and it was like it came with a playlist and like you have to macerate some of the strawberries yourself. And
Mhm.
if you didn't know what macerating was before, you know what it is now.
Mhm.
You macerate the strawberries and you add them to the Mielo Santo and then you get to
Mhm.
arrange the board yourself, and there's like this Italian disco playlist going on in the background. And the
Mhm.
playlist is also a product too, right? Like
Mhm.
it's a product within a product. So
Mhm.
that I think those years were definitely very formative, even though I hated it. And I
Mhm.
was very much like, fuck this old school shit, man. Like, they don't know
Mhm.
what they're talking about. Like, blah,
Mhm.
blah, blah. But it definitely has formed the way I think about creativity and products and just like, you
Mhm.
know, just I think businesses in general on a sort of more macro through a more macro lens.
Mhm. Yeah, it is interesting that you had such a reaction to it, 'cause, I guess I'm curious about, why do you think that you were attracted to it in the end? What did that way of thinking afford you that before going in maybe wouldn't have afforded you, as far as, like,
Mm.
either pleasure or lifestyle or
I think a
viability?
little
Like,
bit was like, yeah, I think a lot of it was like lifestyle and viability too. Like as much as I loved fine art, like I didn't really see a place for it in my life as much
mhm,
because I didn't really want to be like a starving artist. I didn't want to be that sort of Basquiat trope, right? Like
yeah,
I didn't, I sort of wanted to be in a little bit more secure of a situation. And I think also like I am also a little bit more pragmatic than most artists, I would say, if we want to sort of distill it into a type, which is a little bit obtuse, but for the function of this conversation, I'd say, I think I am a little bit more on the side, or at least now I would say a little bit more on the side of like marketing and brand design. Like that's more what's interesting to me than fine art per se. And I
Mhm.
think seeing the capabilities and seeing the potential of art through a more sort of like commercial way, you
Mhm.
know, like when you see someone's work on like a Coke can, that's crazy. You know, like Caroline Liu, who's a Chicago artist, she just moved, but I remember like I met her and we did a collaboration together and it was awesome. And she's super
What's
talented.
what's her thing?
Uh, Her Instagram is Cats and
She
Art.
Cats and Art? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I remember like seeing her shit on the train. Like she had
Mhm.
like a train rap. CTA like partnered with different artists to like rap trains with shit. And I remember being like, yo, that's some shit you can't really do. You can't get that from just sitting in your studio, you
Yeah.
know. I mean, maybe you can, because she definitely like, you know, there's a fine art aspect to her work,
Mhm.
but you know, there's sort of this accessibility that you're afforded through these sort of other avenues, you know.
Mhm. Yeah. To use art, to use your expression, to use your eye for your own lifestyle is a way of using it for your own pleasure. It's like,
For
right.
sure.
And
For
I think that
sure.
there is a necessity to be mindful of the uniqueness of that opportunity and those around you who maybe don't have that or could be benefited from your pursuit as well. So it seems like
Right.
you have really used your platform to share your enjoyment of life, of creating with other people and to help them, in whatever their situations are as well. So how do you come back to like the groundedness of the earth and of things growing? Like where does that come from? Or was that a new expression?
It was definitely a new expression. I mean, we had a relatively large backyard in Brooklyn, and my dad, every time they went home to Trinidad to come back, he would like sneak little cuttings of hibiscus in his shoes. And
Wow.
so, like along, like the center was paved, but along the side were these beds, and it was just like all these crazy colors of hibiscus to like remind him of home, you know. So that's I have like good memories attached to plants, but I was never into plants. Like how I got into plants was through like growing commercially, really. A little sort of quick catch up, left art school, worked in New York. I looked through my portfolio and it was all like I'd done all these posters for Fuck That's Delicious when that was out with Action Bronson.
Mhm.
Like it
Mhm.
was all logos and identities for restaurants and hotels. It was like recipe cards for, you know, designing flatware and stuff like that. My brother had just moved to Skokie and he was like, yo, man, like, I just bought this 3-bedroom house. Like, sounds like you're not doing too hot. Like, if you want to do the school thing, like, come out to Chicago. You know, you can go to Kendall or whatever, and you can just live with me. I just moved here too. Like, you know, it'd be great to live together. And he's significantly older than me. So he was a huge support system. So I ended up coming here, wanted to work in restaurants. Every chef I met was like, don't fucking go to culinary school. That's trash. You know?
Yeah.
So I just started working in restaurants, really. And I met the chef, Nicole Peterson, who's awesome. She's now out in Minneapolis, running a restaurant group there. I got a job as a busser first.
Yeah.
But it was really cool. It was really cool, honestly. The chef there, the CDC at the time, Jake Chappell, he was about my age too. Like I was like 23, 24. So he would like let me, you know, like he'd like put me on the shit, you know, because we became like drinking buddies in a way that you can't do at a downtown restaurant, you know, like.
Mhm.
So I'd be like, yo, Jake, can you show me like how to do the orders or whatever? And he's
Mhm.
like, well, you know, you're off, you're cut, it's 8. Like if you fuck off for a couple hours and then come back, or like if you just dishwasher's out, if you just wash dishes for a while, like yeah, we can do orders, or we can like bust down the lamb and then you know
Mhm.
show me how to butcher the lamb, show me how to do all this shit, show me how to like clean salmon, and so that was a very very cool experience. And then they opened a second restaurant in Evanston, and so Nicole was like, "Hey, do you want to be a prep cook?" Which is like fucking awesome to be honest, because if you're opening a restaurant, why would you have a green prep cook on your, you know, opening
Yeah.
team? But I learned so much, and that was such an opportunity for me, you know. So it's sort of like kind of doing the front of house and back of house thing at the same time. Like I would get to the barn, prep from like 6:30 to like 3-ish, and then I would run over to Found and then expedite or serve from 4:30 to like 10, 11 or whatever. And those were just my days, you know. And at that restaurant, that's where I was introduced to microgreens. I never really knew what they were. And I remember seeing like kind of, again, back to that packaged product thing. Like I remember seeing Adam, who's the owner of Closed Loop Farms. He would come in, but this was like a young guy. And the microgreens came in flats. And so I thought that was really cool because it was like, oh, the product is packaged in the thing that it is made in. Like that's fucking sick. Like there's no packaging. The packaging is the product, kind of, you know? I thought that was fascinating. And he was telling me like, oh yeah, it's all grown indoors, whatever. And so I asked my chef for Adam's number because I was like, yo, I'm trying to pull up on this farm. Where's this farm at? I'm trying to see this shit. And he wouldn't give me his number because like my assumption is that we were doing so hot at the time. We had like no dishwasher, and he used to call me this pinch hitting sous chef. So I think he could see that like, oh, why does he want Adam's number? And so
he want to lose you?
Yeah, and so I knew that Adam always delivered on Fridays around 5, so I just waited in the alley. I like cut pre-shift. Just like waited in the alley, and I was like, hey man, like I'm like, you know, not trying to creep you out, but like I'm just really interested in the product. Like I just think this is really cool. I would love to just come see the farm. Like I'd be down to come help you or whatever. And he was like, yeah, of course. Like come through, gave me his card. And then so that next Monday, took the fucking train all the way from Skokie to fucking 47th and Ashland and got to see the farm. And he was like, hey, like someone called off, like you want to like help me out for a couple hours? And I was like, fuck yeah. And it was just really, really cool. It was so cool. It's in the basement of I don't know if you've been to the plant before.
No, I've seen his operation.
Yeah, it's fucking sick. You know, and at the time it was like maybe 6 or 7 racks, you know, and he also worked in restaurants too. And like, it was just really exciting, you know? And I was like, wow, like look at this product that no one else really has. And the people I found that the people who were selling microgreens were not well versed they weren't steeped in restaurant culture. So they didn't know how to sell it, you know, like they were always selling the wrong shit to the wrong people. They were or selling the wrong shit to the right people, you know? And so I kind of just got really fascinated by it. And so obviously I love social media. Well, I don't know if that's so obvious, but I think social media is fascinating. And so in kind of helping him on these days, I started noticing like, yo, like the social's kind of whack. And I was like, yo, it's just free ad space, bro. Like we should be creating our own content, you know? And so sort of like put together a presentation for him being like, yo, look at Gotham Greens. This is how they're doing their social. Like, look at Farm One, which is a farm in New York. And then from that, we started building a good working relationship. And then so eventually became the sales manager there. And so essentially it was just like the liaison between the chefs and the production team, selling all the product and, you know, doing new sales, knocking on doors, talking to chefs, trying to get them to buy our microgreens. So that's kind of how I got into the plant world and growing. It was from like growing commercially and then sort of being like, oh, I think I want a plant in my home. That'd be nice. And then so started bringing plants home, kind of one at a time, like nothing crazy, honestly. But then I think what the big change was going to different plant shops and seeing that most of the pots were really whack. Like I was like, yo, these pots are trash. Like I don't like these pots. These are not fun. They're not unique. That was more of it too. Like I remember seeing like going to a store and then you see the row of pots and I'm like, all right, so if I buy this, there's 30 pots left here. That means there's 30 other people who would have a similar shit. I don't want to pull up at somebody's crib and be like, oh, you got that shit too? Like, so I started putting my plants in, I thrift a lot and stuff. So I'd find different things and
Mhm.
put plants in them. And I thought that
Mhm.
was really fun. People people came over, they'd be like, oh, that's really cool. I like
Mhm.
that. Like, I'd pay money for that. And I was like, oh, you would pay money for that, you say? What?
Yeah, yeah.
And so the first sort of like jumping off point was my ex at the time. I'd gotten her like a Sansevieria in like this gold hammered, like almost rectangular box, which I thought
Mhm.
was really cool. And so I was like, yo, babe, like, this is for you for
Mhm.
sure. But like, can you help me out with something? I want to post it on my page. And then, which is kind of selfish to be honest in retrospect, but I was just so excited about it, And I was like, hey, can I post this on my page? And then as soon as I post it, you like claim it. So so no one can actually get it. It's yours, but I kind of want to see, like,
Create that
let's,
experience of like, "Oh, it's no longer available."
well, just to
With
like
anybody else
see,
watching.
like, to see like what's the water look like, right? Like,
Mhm.
sort of use it as a barometer.
Yeah.
And people were into it, and like a couple people DM'd me, and a couple people commented, and I was like, oh, okay, this
Mhm.
this is a thing. And then kind of just took it from there, to be
Yeah.
honest.
What aspect of the plant process is your, like, creative thing that's just for you, that then you're okay at this point being like, "Alright, and then I sell it." Like, what do you try and reserve for yourself, or what do you try
What's
and
that precious space?
Yeah, yeah.
It's the storytelling, to be honest, man. Like,
Okay.
it's like, how do you, because that's what marketing is, right? Like, how do you string together a slew of words to get somebody to buy this shit, right? Like,
Mhm.
when you think about, like, I mean, a sort of big obvious example is like Nike, right? Like, they're selling you shoes, but like, they're selling you a fucking lifestyle, yo. Like, they're
Mhm.
selling you that like extra 10 seconds when you're wiped out and you're like, and they're like, yo, if you wear these shoes, you'll get 10 extra seconds, but
Mhm.
they use other people's stories to sort of like build that sort of emotional ecosystem for you, right?
Right,
Like,
right,
and it makes you feel lighter, it makes you feel fresher, it makes you feel
right.
cooler. So I think the storytelling for me is the sort of like that warm air there. Because for example, it, like, to me, that's how I communicate my life and how I communicate my
Mhm.
stories and what I want to tell. Like, for example, like sometimes the captions are like, oh, about they're funny or whatever, but like
Mhm.
sometimes they're not, Like, I remember, like, my parents, like I was saying a little bit about my parents, but like we didn't really hang out in the hood. So they'll be like, oh, we'll go on a drive, we'll drive down to Delaware, get out of the car for 20 minutes, and then we just drive back. But most of the enjoyment was the car time,
Mhm.
you know? And so I remember getting this, I put like an agave in this like marble, it looked like a dog bowl, I'm pretty sure. Freshest dog bowl I ever seen, but it was like this like marble, there's like cream and like these light like purples and pinks. And it reminded me of my mom and those drives because she would always get, like, before we got on the highway, she'd stop, we get a bag of corn nuts and a bag of cream savers. And that reminded me of my mom. Usually the captions are funny or whatever, but that caption, I was like talking about my mother and what those memories meant to me, and
Mhm.
and then, creating those emotional connections with people,
Mhm.
to be like, oh no, this isn't just a product here, like it is, but also like, let me give you a little piece of my world too. And I think
Mhm.
also part of it, and this is a little more recent of a thing, like, I think if you have a product, you have an obligation. A lot of people would disagree, but I would say, especially the smaller business, you have an obligation to use your platform, whatever it is, to sort of, to point us all in the direction of the greater good. Because you have a privilege that most people don't have, right? Like, for
Mhm.
example, you have this podcast. Most fucking people don't have a podcast. So it's your responsibility, at least in my opinion, it's your responsibility to do shit that's equitable, to say shit that's equitable, to, you know, not just be wilding out and hating on people, right? Like, for me too, part of it is like being able to have a voice. Like, most of the time, most of us feel very voiceless all the time. You know, you feel like you're this tiny little quirk in the universe. So to me, that warm air has been like, oh shit, like you can actually say something and get a response. I think the largest example to me to date was like during the George Floyd protests. I actually had COVID that weekend. I like got COVID.
Really? Wow.
Like, I think if George Floyd was killed on Friday, I had gotten a positive test on Thursday.
Wow.
So it was like this crazy, you know, media frenzy. But I was like, you know, I wanted to do something, and I wanted to be out in these streets, you know, like yelling at the fucking cops and shit, you know, and it was impossible to do that. And at first I was like just being sad, and, you know, I was being sad boy in my room. Oh my God, I might die. But then I realized very quickly, like, yo, like you can do something. Like I'm a big believer in like, you have to find your superpower, right? Like everyone can't be Malcolm X. Everyone can't be Jeff Bezos. Not that I think he's a superhero at all, but you know what I mean? Like, everyone has different sort of skill sets. Like, you have to figure out what your superpower is. And so a couple artists, I had like artist series pots, like sort of backed up to, you know, kind of like to pace them out. And so I hit them up. Caroline being one of them, Chad Curry being one of them, Molly Ann Bishop being one of them, Jess Miller being one of them, like all awesome artists, really, really awesome artists that I admire and respect. And was just like, yo, like, I know we were supposed to do this auction shit, but like, can we just like auction this shit off right now? Let's raise some money. Because I wanted to raise some money for the National Bail Fund. Because, you know, people are out there protesting, people who look like you, like white people and black people getting arrested for just saying what's right, right? And they don't deserve to be in jail like that. And so through that, like, we ended up raising $19,000, you know? And that to me was like, whoa, like, and that's when I kind of was like, oh shit, nah, this is like, we've built this whole community here, you know?
I totally agree. I think it's so interesting that you had COVID at that time, just because there is such an obvious limit on your ability to participate in a way that was so commonly being shared as like the way to participate. And I think it's really important for us to continue to remember that there's people who aren't just sick on that day.
Well, they can't be in crowds or
So just really, like you're saying, like really sharing that message as well as everything else of like, how can you do what you can? And that's great too.
I think that's also the key phrase too. Like, that's okay too. That's great too. Because a lot of people are like, well, I'm not protesting, so I'm not doing the right thing. Fuck, I must be racist. And it's like, no, man, it doesn't work like that, you know? And like, I had a great conversation with Jason Hamill from Lula, because I had put up like a video from my room, because I was so upset with, like, you know, especially if you worked in restaurants for so long, you know, it's made sensuous whores of us all. That's what my friend Chad likes to say. And so I think we all kind of hold this, there's a thing about restaurants that we all really love, right? And it embrace. And when I saw so many restaurateurs and so many cafes and so many places that I loved, like, just kind of doing nothing, kind of pissed me off, you know? But then when I talked to a lot of them, they're like, well, I felt frozen. I don't know what to do, blah, blah, blah. And so I'd like put out a line, and I was like, yo, like, I know you got brooms. I know you got mops. You're not selling any food. I know you have coffee. If you're a cafe, I know you got coffee. Like, how would you feel if, like, the night after a protest, you're going out to just like clean up your community and try and get everybody back together, and your fucking favorite cafe pulled up with just like coffee for everyone, you know, like what fuel that would be for you, you know? And that's not saying you got to go protest, not saying you got to go do whatever, but what can you do? Like, I went to a protest and I met Nima and Gur from City Sense Floral. And they were just like, yo, like we got all these roses, and they just handed out like a literal truck full to the protest. And then there was a moment of silence where they asked everyone to get down on their knees,
Mm.
and everyone was on their knees with these roses like held above their heads, and it was such a beautiful, beautiful thing, you know. And I was just like, that's your superpower, you know. That's your thing. It doesn't have to be protesting. It doesn't have to be, you know, going out and fighting cops. I'll go protest. I'm in the back, you know. I'm definitely in the back. I'm not trying to get my ass whooped by some cops, you know. Yeah.
Well, we're coming into the end of our time, so the last question I'll ask you, just kind of in light of all of that, is what you're excited about the communities that you operate in, the circles that you kind of bump into. What do you find is energizing to you at the moment?
Obviously, there is a huge, you know, sadness involved with the pandemic, and you know, I think we're all cognizant, or most of us at least, are cognizant of the damage that's being done. Simultaneously, I did allude to this before, but like I consider myself a humanist. Like I strongly, strongly believe in the potential of the human being and the human mind. I think humans are incredibly plastic and incredibly resilient. So I'm super excited to see. Like I love all this like alt economy shit, man. That shit to me is so exciting, and I think for a lot of people, it's like breaking down tons of limits, right? Like people who were like, oh, well, I guess if I needed to be a therapist, I need to go to school, and then I need to join a practice, and then I need to work there for 15 years, and then I need to then I can maybe start my own practice if I get enough clients. Like there are therapists, like I know Jess Miller, the ceramicist I was talking about. She was like, yeah, I just started my own practice because of COVID. Like before, you couldn't do you couldn't teletherapy. It was like a lot of people's insurance wouldn't cover it, but now because of the pandemic, people are realizing like, yo, you can do therapy at home. You can do video. Like I do Zoom therapy. I do phone therapy. Like you can do that shit. And so to be able to see like, oh wow, like all of these things that were not a thing before for whatever arbitrary rules or reasons, there's lots of opportunity here, right? Like I kind of think of it almost like a forest fire. Like after the forest fire, all that ash, rich soil, baby. You got real rich soil, you know? And so seeing all these people, especially artists, like, all right, what is this virtual gallery that you're gonna put on? Like, what is this like cool experience that you're putting together for people? Like Afropunk, the festival in Brooklyn, that shit's going all virtual this year. You can sit with your homies, dress up if you want to, and just like have this festival experience, right? And so seeing how restaurants are accommodating this change, seeing, you know, people like Ryan Pfeiffer from Blackbird, like seeing him. He's used to doing fucking, you know, I don't know him personally, but just from watching his work, it's like he's used to white tablecloth shit, you know, tasting menus, baby. It's like he's making spaghetti pockets and like, you know, slutty ass burgers and shit, you know, and like it's just kind of fun to see, you know, and it makes you feel like, oh, all these things that I thought were rules, not really rules. You know, which is really, really exciting. And that's like, to me, that's like, that is invigorating because then that makes me feel like, oh, well, I thought I needed a store. Maybe I don't need a store, you know? And even if I do get a store eventually, it doesn't necessarily have to be just plants. What does it look like if it's a community center? What does it look like if it's, you know, I think most people, they're always like, oh, I want like a clothing store and a gallery and a fashion, you know, you have these ideal dreams, but it's like, I think we're in a space now where that feels a little more like you can white knuckle that a little bit more, right? Where you're like, well, ain't shit else to do but figure out how to make your shit work. Like, how do we make this work, you know? So I guess I'm feeling very morbidly and darkly optimistic right now. And just seeing all the creativity has been giving me a lot of life and optimism, to be honest. Because I think if we were all just sad and in a hole. And, you know, it's like you're seeing people being like, all right, can't do that. Gotta do something else. We'll fucking
Yeah.
figure this shit out. And I think
Mhm.
there's a lot of good engine fuel there for
Mhm.
people, you know, especially people who are sort of like in the creative field who aren't necessarily artists, but they aren't necessarily engineers, you know,
Mm.
and they
Yeah.
sort of need to like they exist in that in between space, right?
Mhm.
Where they sort of need permission to be and create.
Wonderful. That's great.
Yeah, man.
Well, Damien, thank you so much for your time. This has been really
Yeah,
enjoyable.
thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate the because I like have a lot of shit to do today. So now I'm like I feel very filled up, and I
Good.
appreciate the conversation.
I look forward to meeting you out in the public
Out in
someday.
the real world, yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
and seeing where you go. So,
All right,
all right,
Jeff. You have a
take
good
care of
day, my
yourself.
man.
All right, bye.